In a quiet suburb, where the tranquility of Somerset Hills masked the complexities of modern society, an unsettling encounter unfolded that would challenge long-standing prejudices and ignite conversations about justice and equality. Ethan Carter, a distinguished judge, was driving his newly purchased Audi through the serene streets. His life had been one of relentless determination, rising from the hardships of a poor neighborhood to become one of the youngest and most respected judges in Maryland. His journey was marked by perseverance, education, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. As he drove home, the scent of the new car's leather interior mixed with the gentle strains of jazz playing through the high-end sound system. The soothing ambiance inside the car contrasted starkly with the memories that occasionally resurfaced. Memories of his youth in Baltimore, where the color of his skin often dictated how he was perceived. He had spent years fighting those perceptions, proving time and again that he was more than the prejudices he faced. But prejudice is resilient. It lurks in unexpected places, waiting for moments to rear its head. Tonight would be one such moment. The red and blue lights of a police car flashed in his rearview mirror, cutting through the peaceful evening. Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. He hadn't broken any traffic laws, of that he was certain. With a sigh, he pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and waited. From the police car, Officer Jennifer Daniels emerged. Her steps were purposeful, her demeanor stern. Jennifer had a reputation for being strict and decisive, but beneath that tough exterior was a history that shaped her actions. Her father, a truck driver, had been killed during a highway robbery when she was a teenager. That trauma left her with a deep-seated mistrust of unfamiliar situations, particularly when luxury vehicles seemed out of place. As she approached the Audi, her eyes narrowed. The sleek vehicle and the well-dressed black man behind the wheel triggered her suspicions. It wasn't an uncommon bias in law enforcement, one that Ethan had fought against his entire life, both personally and professionally. Jennifer knocked on the window with a gloved finger. The sound echoed in the stillness. Ethan rolled down the window, offering a polite smile. "License and registration," she demanded curtly, her tone devoid of any greeting or explanation. Ethan complied, retrieving his documents and handing them over. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm. Jennifer examined the papers meticulously, as if searching for something amiss. Her gaze returned to Ethan, cold and suspicious. "We've received reports of a vehicle matching this description being stolen in the area. This car is a perfect match." Ethan frowned. "This is my car. I bought it from a dealership a few days ago. You're welcome to verify the plates. Everything's legitimate." But Jennifer's doubts weren't easily dispelled. To her, the scene felt off. She had seen luxury cars driven by individuals who didn't seem to belong in affluent neighborhoods. The assumptions she made were rooted in her experiences, but they were also fueled by ingrained biases she hadn't addressed. "Step out of the vehicle," she commanded. Ethan's expression shifted to one of restrained disbelief. "Officer, I don't understand the reason for this." Jennifer's patience was wearing thin. "Step out now," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Suppressing his frustration, Ethan opened the door and stepped out. His tall frame exuded confidence, even in the face of unwarranted scrutiny. Standing straight, he looked Jennifer in the eye. "I am Judge Ethan Carter," he stated firmly. "This is my car. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Jennifer's expression didn't change. His name, his title, none of it seemed to register. Her hand hovered near her holstered firearm, a gesture that conveyed both authority and caution. "Face the car. Hands on the hood," she ordered. For a moment, Ethan stood still, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He had spent years advocating for justice, fighting against the very biases he now faced. The irony was not lost on him. Slowly, he complied, placing his hands on the hood of his car. The cool metal beneath his palms felt like a harsh reminder of the reality he couldn't escape. Jennifer began a pat-down, her movements efficient and methodical. Ethan remained silent, his mind racing. Memories of his youth flooded back. The times he was stopped, questioned, and treated as a suspect simply because of his skin color. He had thought those days were behind him. "Officer Daniels," he began, his voice steady but firm. "You're making a mistake." Jennifer paused, looking up at him. "We'll see about that." At that moment, a neighbor stepped out of a nearby house, curiosity piqued by the flashing lights and unusual commotion. The man recognized Ethan immediately. Judge Carter. The neighbor called out, concern evident in his voice. Jennifer glanced over, her expression momentarily faltering. You know him. Of course, the neighbor replied. He's our neighbor. And he's a judge. What's going on here? The weight of the situation began to sink in for Jennifer. Her assumptions, her biases, they were unraveling in real time. She looked back at Ethan, who met her gaze with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. You can verify my identity, Ethan said calmly. You have my documents. You can check my credentials. Jennifer nodded slowly, stepping back. She retrieved her radio, calling in to verify Ethan's information. The response came quickly. Confirmed. Judge Ethan Carter. Maryland State Judiciary. Jennifer's face paled. The gravity of her actions hit her. She had detained a judge without cause, driven by her own biases. I'm sorry, she muttered, her voice barely audible. Ethan straightened, lowering his hands. Officer Daniels, this isn't just about me. It's about the assumptions we make and the impact they have. Jennifer nodded, shame evident in her posture. I need to do better. Ethan offered a faint smile. We all do. Everything before proceeding further, I have nothing to hide, but Jennifer didn't respond. She circled Ethan, scrutinizing him as if looking for any flaw or opening. Memories of her father's tragedy and past suspects flooded her mind, driving her actions tonight. For Jennifer, this wasn't just a job. It was a silent vendetta against what she believed the world had taken from her. The flashing lights reflected off the Audi's polished surface, enveloping them both in an icy glow. Ethan stood still, hands on the car, his mind racing with questions. Why was he subjected to this here, in the neighborhood he called home? And why, after all he had achieved, did he still have to prove his innocence? Ethan leaned against the Audi as the police car's flashing lights continued to illuminate his face in a cold, unforgiving glow. The atmosphere between him and Officer Jennifer Daniels was thick with tension and suspicion. Taking a deep breath, he steadied his voice, maintaining as much calm as possible, though every word carried the weight of injustice he could not ignore. Officer Daniels, he said evenly, his tone calm but resolute. I've made it clear. I am Judge Ethan Carter. I work at the Maryland District Court. This car is mine, purchased from a dealership just days ago. All the documents are in order. Jennifer stood opposite him, unmoving. Her skeptical gaze unwavering. Her hand hovered near the firearm on her belt, a reflexive action that only heightened the tension in the air. To Jennifer, Ethan's story sounded too perfect. A black man driving a gleaming Audi in a wealthy neighborhood. It all triggered the instinct she had honed during years in law enforcement. Judge or not, you'll need to prove it, Jennifer replied coldly. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Ethan froze, his eyes locking with Jennifer's, as if searching for a glimmer of humanity in her gaze. He found none but cold detachment. I don't understand the reason for this, he said firmly. All the information you need is in the documents I've provided. You don't have to do this. Jennifer took another step closer, her voice sharp and commanding. I don't need you to tell me how to do my job. Stand still and put your hands behind your back. Her tone, laced with unapologetic arrogance, struck Ethan like a slap to his dignity. Yet, instead of retaliating, he turned his gaze toward the Audi, where the car's headlights reflected off the glossy surface like a mirror. In that reflection, memories from his past came rushing back, pulling him into a moment from years ago. He vividly recalled an afternoon when he was 16, leaving a tutoring session with a backpack full of books slung over his shoulder. His worn sneakers squeaked on the pavement as a police car suddenly pulled up, its siren blaring. Two officers stepped out, their eyes scrutinizing him with suspicion. Stop right there, kid, one of them shouted. Startled and confused, Ethan froze. What's going on? He asked hesitantly. We got reports of a kid matching your description hanging around this area. Hand over your bag, one officer demanded authoritatively. Ethan tried to explain that he was just a student and had done nothing wrong, but no one listened. He was pushed against a wall as his backpack was searched, books and pencils spilling onto the ground, a symbolic representation of his helplessness against a system that refused to hear him. His mother had arrived just in time to defuse the situation, but the pain of the officer's accusatory glances lingered with Ethan for years. He had promised himself then that he would never let anyone, including himself, suffer such injustice again. But now, years later, as a successful man, Ethan realized nothing had truly changed. He stood once more under the harsh glare of police lights, treated like a suspect solely because of his appearance. Ethan looked directly at Jennifer, his composure beginning to crack. "Officer Daniels, you are crossing a line. I know my rights. You cannot detain me without just cause," he said firmly. Jennifer stiffened, sensing the defiance in Ethan's words. Yet deep down, a small part of her began to question whether something was amiss. She glanced at the car's documents in her hand, then back at Ethan. Still, instead of retreating, she tightened her grip on her belt as though the gesture could fortify her authority in this escalating situation. "I'll decide what's justified," she said, her voice remaining cold, though a hint of doubt crept into her tone. "Now, I need you to cooperate." Ethan exhaled heavily, suppressing a surge of anger rising in his chest. He wanted to push back, to speak out, but memories of his past encounter with the police held him back. He understood that any action he took now could be misinterpreted and worsen the situation. "Fine," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'll comply. But you will be held accountable for your actions." Jennifer took a small step back, her skeptical gaze unrelenting, though a flicker of uncertainty appeared. It was as if she was questioning whether she had gone too far. Instead of acknowledging it, she signaled for Ethan to place his hands on the hood and proceeded to inspect his documents again, this time with mechanical precision. The tension between them hung like a taut wire, every movement weighted with the burden of unspoken injustice that neither could fully acknowledge. The encounter was far from over, but Ethan knew that no matter how it unfolded, he would not allow this incident to become another haunting memory of humiliation in his life. The flashing police lights cast their glow over the quiet street, shattering its usual tranquility. Ethan remained still, hands pressed against the hood of his Audi, as Jennifer Daniels continued to scrutinize his documents, her expression of doubt unchanged. From the nearby homes, curtains began to shift. A few curious neighbors peeked out, their gazes a mix of intrigue and apprehension. In the nearest house, James Walker, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 3 decades, stood leaning against his window frame. His silver hair and weary demeanor reflected the weight of his years. A retired history teacher, James was no stranger to tales of injustice. He had witnessed countless similar incidents throughout his life, and each one weighed heavily on him. James's mind flashed back to an incident years ago when a young black man was detained in this very neighborhood simply for walking at night. Despite the lack of evidence, baseless suspicion had turned an innocent man into a target. The memory now surged back, compelling James to act. Watching Ethan, forced to keep his hands on the hood, James could no longer stand idle. Adjusting his light sweater, he stepped out of his house and slowly approached the police car. The streetlights illuminated his thin frame, but his voice was steady and commanding as he spoke. "Officer, may I ask what's going on here?" James addressed Jennifer, his gaze filled with displeasure. "Ethan is my neighbor. He's a respectable man, and I can't see any reason for you to treat him this way." Jennifer looked up, momentarily taken aback by the elderly man standing before her. But she quickly regained her professional cold demeanor, her lips pressed tightly as though refusing to explain. "Sir, please return to your home," she said sternly. "This is a legal matter, and I advise you not to interfere." James narrowed his eyes, his voice growing more assertive. "I'm not interfering. I simply want to know if humiliating a man in front of his home like this is truly necessary. If you need to check his documents, then do so. But this action seems excessive." Jennifer offered no response. Her eyes flicked over James before returning to the documents in her hand, deliberately ignoring his presence. But James's intervention was not without impact. Other neighbors began stepping outside, standing on their porches or peering from windows, watching intently. A few quietly captured the scene with their phones. The silence was palpable, but Ethan could feel the weight of their gazes, a spotlight he hadn't sought, making him feel as though he was being. Ethan felt his heart pounding as the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. The weight of the situation pressed down on him with an oppressive force. He stood there, restrained, in front of the gleaming Audi that he had proudly purchased just days before. The flashing lights of the police car painted the quiet suburban street in an eerie mix of red and blue, casting long shadows against the walls of the houses that lined the neighborhood. Jennifer Daniels stood a step behind him, her hand still gripping the cuffs. Her expression was stern, almost unreadable, but inside, her thoughts were a chaotic storm. Her mind replayed the moment she had decided to put the cuffs on him. It wasn't just protocol, it was something more, something deeply personal that she couldn't quite articulate. Her father's face flickered in her memory, the sound of his laughter and the warmth of his hugs now tainted by the memory of his violent death. Judge Carter, she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. This is just procedure. If everything checks out, you'll be on your way. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, taking in the words. They sounded hollow, like an echo from a distant place, devoid of any real meaning. He had heard similar reassurances before, empty promises that did little to mask the underlying prejudice. Procedure. Ethan's voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of frustration. Is this what you call justice? Jennifer didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to glance at the small crowd that had gathered. Neighbors stood on their porches, their faces a mix of confusion, concern, and outrage. Phones were still pointed in their direction, capturing every moment. Jennifer could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She had been trained to handle pressure, but this felt different. It wasn't just the pressure of doing her job, it was the pressure of facing her own biases. James Walker stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of stern disapproval. His presence was a constant reminder of the moral weight of the situation. His voice rang out once again, steady and unwavering. Officer Daniels, he called out. Is this really necessary? The man has provided you with all the documentation. Why humiliate him like this? Jennifer's jaw tightened. She hated being questioned, especially in front of a crowd. It made her feel vulnerable, exposed. But James Walker's words struck a chord deep within her, a chord that resonated with the doubts she had tried so hard to suppress. Sir, please step back, Jennifer replied, her tone firm. I'm handling this. James didn't move. He held his ground, his gaze never wavering from Jennifer's. Handling this. It doesn't look like justice to me. It looks like something else entirely. Ethan turned his head slightly, enough to catch James's gaze. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Ethan appreciated the support, but he also knew that this situation could escalate further if emotions ran too high. Mr. Walker, Ethan said softly, his voice carrying across the street. Thank you. But please, let's not make things worse. James frowned but gave a small nod. He stepped back, though his expression remained one of quiet defiance. Jennifer exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of her emotions. She turned her attention back to the radio in her hand, waiting for the verification to come through. The seconds felt like hours. The voice on the other end crackled to life, delivering the confirmation that the car was indeed registered to Judge Ethan Carter. Jennifer's grip on the radio tightened. Her heart sank. She had made a mistake. She stepped toward Ethan, her voice quieter now, the arrogance drained from her tone. Judge Carter, your documents have been verified. You're free to go. Ethan didn't move immediately. He stood there, his hands still cuffed behind his back, waiting for Jennifer to unlock the restraints. The silence stretched on, the tension between them palpable. Jennifer finally reached for the key and unlocked the cuffs, letting them fall away from Ethan's wrists. He rubbed his wrists briefly, the red marks standing out against his skin. He turned to face Jennifer, his gaze steady and unwavering. You know, Ethan said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity, you had a choice tonight. You chose to see me as a suspect. Instead of a neighbor. Instead of a man. Jennifer looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Her mind raced with thoughts, memories, justifications. But none of them seemed sufficient. I was just doing my job, she murmured, though even she didn't believe the words anymore. No, Ethan replied, his voice firm. You were doing what you thought was right. But sometimes, what we think is right is influenced by things we don't even realize. By fear. By prejudice. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jennifer felt her chest tighten. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew Ethan was right. Her actions had been driven by something more than just procedure. James Walker stepped forward again, his voice calm but resolute. Officer Daniels, we all have a duty to uphold justice. But justice isn't about assumptions. It's about fairness. Equality. Jennifer nodded slowly, her eyes still avoiding Ethan's. I understand, she whispered. Ethan took a step closer, his expression softening just a fraction. It's not about one night, Officer Daniels. It's about changing the way we see each other. The way we treat each other. That's how we move forward. Jennifer finally met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw Ethan not as a suspect, but as a man who had been wronged. A man who deserved respect. The crowd began to disperse slowly, neighbors retreating back into their homes. James Walker lingered for a moment longer, giving Ethan a small nod before heading back to his house. Jennifer stood there, the weight of the night pressing down on her. The flashing lights of the police car still illuminated the street, casting long shadows. She knew that this night would stay with her, a reminder of her mistakes, but also a chance to learn and grow. Ethan turned toward his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened the door and paused, glancing back at Jennifer one last time. Good night, Officer Daniels, he said softly. Jennifer nodded. Good night, Judge Carter. As Ethan drove away, the street fell silent once more. Jennifer remained standing by the police car, lost in thought. The events of the night replayed in her mind, each moment etched into her memory. She knew that she had a long way to go, but tonight had planted a seed of awareness, of understanding. And as the police lights finally faded, Jennifer Daniels stood alone on the street, the weight of her badge feeling heavier than ever before. The metallic clink of the handcuffs locking around Ethan Carter's wrists echoed unmistakably in the quiet street, a harsh declaration of public humiliation. The sound cut through the still air, leaving a resonant tension that hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. The murmurs of the gathered crowd grew louder, rippling with discontent. Some voiced their disapproval openly, their words sharp and accusatory. Others stood in silence, their phones raised to record every moment, capturing the scene for posterity and, perhaps, justice. James Walker, the elderly neighbor with a steadfast sense of community, emerged once again from his home. His steps were deliberate, his posture tense with righteous anger. His voice, usually calm and measured, now brimmed with frustration and indignation. Ethan hasn't done anything wrong. James shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs. This is a blatant abuse of power, officer. You're humiliating a man without even fully verifying his information. Jennifer Daniels, the officer responsible for this spectacle, tried to maintain her composure. She tightened her grip on Ethan's wrist, as though the act itself could validate her authority and suppress the rising tide of doubt creeping into her mind. The judgmental eyes of the neighborhood bore into her, making her acutely aware of the scrutiny. But she couldn't allow herself to falter. Not now. Not in front of them. Ethan stood tall, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed forward. His silence spoke volumes, a dignified resistance in the face of humiliation. Yet, beneath his stoic exterior, a deep, indescribable pain churned within him. Despite all he had accomplished in life, despite his status, his education, and his reputation, here he was, still treated as a suspect, still reduced to a stereotype. You're wrong, Ethan finally said, his voice low but deliberate, each word carrying undeniable strength. I demand you confirm my information immediately. I am Judge Ethan Carter. If you don't believe me, call your superior. Jennifer's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip on the radio. Doubt gnawed at her resolve, but her pride and her training kept her from backing down completely. We'll handle this at the station, she said, her voice firm but lacking the conviction it once held. Ethan turned his head to look directly at her, his eyes filled with disappointment rather than anger. You're not just humiliating me, he said, his tone calm but cutting. You're humiliating yourself. The tension reached a breaking point as another police car slowly pulled up to the scene. Its lights were dimmed, but its arrival heightened the charged atmosphere. The neighborhood watched with bated breath, the weight of anticipation pressing down on them. Captain Michael Monroe stepped out of the vehicle with a deliberate air of authority. His salt and pepper hair and composed demeanor commanded respect. He scanned the scene with practiced precision, taking in the crowd, the phones recording every second, and finally, the handcuffed judge standing in quiet defiance. Jennifer stiffened at the sight of her superior. She knew Monroe well, a man who tolerated no mistakes, especially ones that could damage the department's reputation. Her heart pounded in her chest as Monroe's gaze landed on her. Jennifer, Monroe said, his voice steady but laced with authority. Release him. Now. Jennifer's hands clenched at her sides. Captain, I believe there might be, she began, but Monroe cut her off. There are no might be's, Monroe snapped. Ethan Carter is one of the most respected figures in this community. I will not allow my department to damage his reputation. Release him immediately. Jennifer's stomach twisted in knots. She knew she had overstepped, but admitting it in front of the crowd felt unbearable. Slowly, reluctantly, she took out the key to the handcuffs. Her hands, so used to cuffing suspects with ease, now trembled as she unlocked them. The cuffs came off, but the weight of the moment remained, pressing down on everyone present. Ethan rubbed his wrists, his gaze never leaving Jennifer. His silence carried more weight than any outburst could. It was a silence that conveyed disappointment, weariness, and an unspoken question. How many more times would this happen? Captain Monroe stepped closer to Jennifer, his expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. Jennifer, we need to talk, he said quietly. Then, turning to Ethan, he spoke with a tone of sincere regret. Judge Carter, on behalf of my department, I apologize for what happened here tonight. This was a serious error in judgment. We will investigate this incident thoroughly and ensure it doesn't happen again. Ethan studied Monroe for a long moment before finally speaking. I don't need promises, Captain Monroe, Ethan said, his voice steady. I need action. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Daniels to feel justified in their actions. It's about a culture that perpetuates these biases. Monroe nodded solemnly. You're right. And I intend to take action. But I also hope you understand that we're committed to improvement. Jennifer stood off to the side, feeling isolated from the conversation. Ethan's earlier words echoed in her mind. You're not just humiliating me. You're humiliating yourself. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the murmurs fading into the night. But the impact of what had transpired lingered. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a larger, systemic issue, one that wouldn't be solved with a single apology. Ethan turned to leave, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had endured. As he walked away, he glanced back at Jennifer one last time. Think about what you've done, he said quietly. Not just tonight, but every time you've made assumptions about someone based on appearances. Change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from within. Jennifer watched him go, his words lingering long after he disappeared from view. Captain Monroe placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of both support and warning. We're going to have a long talk tomorrow, Monroe said. Get some rest. You're going to need it. Jennifer nodded numbly. As she made her way back to her patrol car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something within her had shifted. Doubts she had long suppressed now clamored for attention. The image of Ethan Carter's disappointed gaze haunted her thoughts, challenging her to confront the biases she had carried for too long. The neighborhood fell silent once more, but the events of the night would not be forgotten. They would linger in conversations, in whispers, in the quiet reflection of those who had witnessed it all. And for Jennifer Daniels, the journey toward understanding and redemption was just beginning. Same respect and dignity they deserve. We cannot continue to live in a world where the color of someone's skin determines the way they are treated, where the assumption is that they are lesser, that they do not belong. The fact that it took a moment like this to remind us of that truth speaks volumes. This is not just about one incident, not just about what happened to me. It's about something much bigger, something that has affected too many of us for too long. The truth is, every day, people are being held back, targeted, or even hurt because of something they cannot control, because of the skin they were born into. And tonight, I want to challenge all of us to change that. To be better. Ethan paused, his eyes scanning the room again, feeling the weight of the collective history and experiences each person brought with them. His words were not just for those who had witnessed his own ordeal, but for everyone in the room who had, in their own way, been affected by the broader issue at hand. He glanced toward the officers sitting beside him, Captain Monroe and Officer Daniels. Their presence there, despite the tension, was an indication that they too were part of this conversation. Ethan's gaze lingered on Jennifer Daniels for a brief moment before he spoke again. I stand here, not just to speak for myself, but for all the voices that have been silenced, Ethan continued. For those who have been wronged and ignored, for those who have had to live in fear, and for those who have suffered in ways too many to count. This is about creating a future where no one else has to experience what I went through. It's about making sure that our children, my son, don't have to grow up with the same burdens, the same fear, the same pain. The room was still, everyone hanging on his every word, absorbing the gravity of what he was saying. It was clear that they understood the seriousness of the moment. And yet, despite the heavy emotions, Ethan's words brought a spark of hope, a recognition that change was possible, that it could start here, with them, with this community. He turned slightly to look at Captain Monroe, who was sitting with his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful, perhaps even regretful. Jennifer Daniels, however, looked away, her face unreadable. Ethan wasn't expecting instant reconciliation, but he did hope for one thing: accountability. I know this isn't easy, Ethan continued, his voice now softer, more personal. But sometimes, we have to confront uncomfortable truths in order to move forward. Sometimes, we need to acknowledge the parts of our society that are broken, that perpetuate division, inequality, and injustice. We need to stop pretending that it's not happening. We need to talk about it. And when we do, we need to be brave enough to make change, even when it feels hard. He looked around the room again, meeting the eyes of the people seated before him. He could see the uncertainty, the fear, and the hope. These were real people, his neighbors, his community, and together, they could make a difference. I want to ask something of all of you today, Ethan said, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet intensity. I want you to be a part of this change. I want you to join me in standing up against the systems that allow this kind of treatment to continue. I want us to come together, not just to talk about the problem, but to act. To demand more from our leaders, from our law enforcement, and from ourselves. We have to hold each other accountable, and we have to lift up those who have been left behind. There was a pause, and Ethan could feel the tension in the room shift, as if something had been released. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. The first step toward understanding, toward real change. Some people in the audience nodded, others whispered quietly among themselves. Ethan's words were resonating, and he could feel that, despite the painful nature of the conversation, they were moving in the right direction. Ethan took a deep breath and continued, his focus now on the larger implications of his message. I know this won't be easy, and I know there will be challenges ahead. But we have to keep pushing. We can't let fear or doubt hold us back. We owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to future generations to make sure they inherit a better world than the one we were given. A world where dignity, respect, and equality are not privileges, but rights. A world where no one is treated as less than because of the color of their skin, the place they come from, or the identity they carry. As he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, and then, slowly, applause began to fill the room. It was hesitant at first, but it grew stronger with each passing second. Ethan stood there, quietly absorbing the emotion of the room. He knew this was only the beginning, but it was a powerful beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the work would be difficult, but it was worth it. After the meeting, Ethan found himself reflecting on what had transpired. The words he had shared, the responses from his neighbors, and the role he now felt compelled to take on. He knew that his decision to speak out, to confront this issue head-on, was just the beginning of something far larger than any one person. It was a movement, a call for justice, for equality, for change. The evening ended, but the conversations did not. People lingered, talking in small groups, exchanging thoughts, ideas, and feelings. Some still seemed unsure of what action to take, others were eager to move forward. It was clear that the conversation had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, people were starting to feel like they could be part of the solution. They had seen the impact of one man's story, and they were ready to make sure that story wouldn't be one that was repeated in silence. Ethan left the community center that night, his resolve stronger than ever. He knew that, though this particular chapter had ended, the real work had just begun. The real change would come from those who were willing to stand up, speak out, and refuse to accept the status quo. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. As he drove home, the quiet hum of the car filled the space between him and the world outside. His thoughts were clear, his purpose unwavering. There was much to do, and he was ready to take the first steps, no matter how hard they might be. At home, as he entered the house, he was greeted by his family, their faces reflecting the pride and support they had for him. His wife, Sophia, embraced him first, her arms wrapping around him as if to remind him that he was not alone. Their son, Jordan, stood nearby, his eyes filled with determination, a silent promise that he too would carry this fight forward. Ethan Carter had never felt so conflicted. Standing at the front of the community center, surrounded by neighbors who had witnessed the harrowing events of the previous night, his heart felt heavy. But his resolve was unwavering. The voices of the community had to be heard, not just for him, but for every individual who had ever faced unjust treatment, and for every family that had been hurt by systems that failed them. He had to speak up. He couldn't let this moment pass without action. "Thank you for gathering here tonight," Ethan began, his voice calm but firm, resonating through the quiet room. He looked at the faces in front of him, some expressions full of curiosity, others filled with anger, but all of them carrying a weight of unspoken understanding. "I stand before you not just as your neighbor, but as a man who has been treated unfairly, and someone who is asking for change. This isn't just my story. It's the story of anyone who has been marginalized, anyone who has felt the sting of injustice simply because of who they are." There was a pause as the room absorbed his words. Some nodded in agreement, others sat still, their minds churning, reflecting on his plea for justice. Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "What happened to me last night wasn't just about my dignity being stripped away. It was about a system that repeatedly fails those who look like me. And that is unacceptable." He let the silence linger for a moment before adding, "I have spent my life fighting for justice, serving as a judge, trying to make things right. But when something like this happens, it's a stark reminder that we still have so much to do." As his words echoed in the room, a small murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Ethan could feel the energy shift, a mix of tension and hope hanging in the air. This wasn't just about one man confronting injustice, it was a community coming together to reflect on something much bigger, something that had been festering for far too long. Turning his gaze toward Captain Monroe and Officer Jennifer Daniels, who sat beside him at the table, Ethan spoke again, this time with even more intensity. "We need a new approach to law enforcement. It's not enough to simply protect the community. The people who serve must respect the dignity of everyone they are sworn to protect." A ripple of applause spread through the room, hesitant at first, but growing as the community rallied behind the call for change. Ethan took a breath, the moment heavy with the weight of possibility. He had spoken not just for himself, but for those who couldn't speak up, for the silent majority that faced prejudice daily. Jennifer Daniels sat motionless, her hands folded in front of her, a sense of shame settling in. She had expected this. She had braced herself for it. But nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming realization of just how far she had fallen short. Ethan's words had cracked something open within her, something that had remained buried, something she had tried to avoid for years. It was a reckoning. When the applause died down, Jennifer stood, her knees weak beneath her, but her resolve steeled. She had to speak now, not just to the room, but to herself. With a deep breath, she approached the microphone. Her voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger as she went on. "I know my actions that night were wrong," she said, her words clear and full of sorrow. "I acted out of fear and prejudice, and I can never undo that. I take full responsibility for what I did. But I don't want my apology to be just words. I want to show this community that I am committed to changing. I want to learn, to grow, and to be better." She paused, locking eyes with Ethan. "Thank you, Judge Carter. Not just for your forgiveness, but for giving me the chance to make things right." Her words lingered in the air, met with a silence that felt both uncomfortable and full of potential. Captain Monroe, a man of authority who had spent years managing law enforcement in the area, stood next. His voice, though steady and commanding, held a note of humility. "As the head of law enforcement in this town," he began, "I am accountable for the actions of my officers. I pledge to make changes. We will begin focusing on more comprehensive training, addressing bias, and ensuring that every member of our community is treated with fairness and respect." He turned to Ethan, his voice softening. "Thank you for ensuring this incident didn't slip by unnoticed. This community will change because of it." The applause that followed was louder than before, stronger, fueled by the collective desire for change. Some stood in support, applauding with genuine hope for what was to come. Ethan felt a flicker of relief, but he knew this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. After the meeting, neighbors approached Ethan, thanking him for speaking out, for being the voice they often couldn't find. They shook his hand, offering words of gratitude and solidarity. Sophia and Jordan, standing near the back of the room, watched with pride. Their faces radiated encouragement, knowing this was a moment of growth, not just for Ethan, but for the entire community. Ethan stepped outside the community center, the evening air cool against his skin. He looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above. For the first time that night, he felt a sense of hope. The road ahead would be long, but tonight, something had been set in motion. He had planted a seed, one that would grow into something much bigger than himself. Change was coming, and he would make sure of it. As the days passed, Jennifer Daniels carried the weight of her actions with her. She could no longer run from the truth. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, guiding her toward a new path. She had to confront not just the community's judgment, but her own. It was time to acknowledge her past and the prejudices she had allowed to shape her decisions. A few days later, Jennifer visited Ethan at the courthouse. Stepping into his office felt like entering a different world, one where justice wasn't just a concept, but a lived reality. Ethan looked up as she entered, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Officer Daniels," he greeted, his voice calm. "How can I help?" Jennifer stood still for a moment, taking in the weight of the situation. She had to be honest, not just with him, but with herself. She took a deep breath. "Judge Carter," she began, her voice soft but sincere. "I'm here to apologize, not just because it's expected, but because I know I was wrong. I let fear and prejudice guide my actions, and I forgot that my duty is to protect everyone, equally." She met his gaze, unwavering. "I know I can't change the past, but I am committed to making things right. I've signed up for bias training, and I want to work to rebuild trust in this community. I'm ready to learn and grow." Ethan listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he spoke, his voice measured. "I accept your apology, Officer Daniels. But words are just the beginning. It's your actions from here on that will define your commitment." Jennifer nodded firmly, a sense of determination settling within her. "I understand, Judge Carter. I will prove it." Ethan extended his hand, and Jennifer grasped it, feeling the weight of the promise she was making. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. As Jennifer left the courthouse, she carried with her a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about redemption for her. It was about changing the system, becoming the person she was meant to be, someone who served with respect, empathy, and a commitment to justice. Ethan, too, knew that this was just the beginning. A few weeks later, he founded the nonprofit organization Justice and Hope. The goal was clear: to address systemic injustice through education, community outreach, and legal support. Jennifer, now an advocate for the cause, worked alongside Ethan, helping to reform the justice system from within. At a large community meeting, Ethan stood before a group of officers, lawyers, and residents, sharing his story not with anger, but with a belief in the possibility of change. "The past does not define us," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Our response to it does." As the room erupted into applause, Ethan stepped outside, his heart filled with hope. He had planted a seed, and though the journey would be long and difficult, he was no longer walking alone. He had the support of his community, his family, and his own unwavering belief in the power of change. His work was just beginning, but he was determined to ensure that the fight for justice continued, not just for himself or his family, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of inequality. And with each step forward, each conversation, and each act of change, the dream of a fairer world seemed just a little bit closer to reality. Ethan smiled, feeling the warmth of their love and the weight of their shared commitment. Together, they would face the challenges ahead. Together, they would stand for justice.